Mama Daniel, drained from the outburst, collapsed onto her mat. Her tears continued to fall until she drifted into a restless sleep, unaware of the chain of events her prayer had unleashed. The following week, Daniel's once thriving company was hit by a sudden and unexpected scandal. News broke out across major platforms, exposing alleged unethical practices in his business dealings. Within hours, the company's assets were frozen as investigations began. Daniel, confident in his power and connections, tried to use his influence to resolve the issue. But no matter how many phone calls he made or meetings he attended, the situation only grew worse. Then came the lawsuits. They poured in like a flood, some over petty issues that could have easily been resolved in calmer times. These lawsuits drained what little energy and resources Daniel still had, further damaging the company's already fragile reputation. Investors, once confident in his leadership, began pulling out, voicing their concerns about his ability to manage the crisis. Trust, a cornerstone of his business success, vanished almost overnight. To make matters worse, everything seemed to hit at once. What could have been manageable problems individually became insurmountable when piled together. The overwhelming nature of the crisis left Daniel and his company in shambles. His efforts to regain control were fruitless. Key projects were abandoned, staff morale plummeted, and the company's value spiraled downward. For the first time, Daniel found himself powerless. But the worst betrayal was yet to come. In an emergency board meeting, called to address the growing chaos, Daniel's closest business partners turned against him. They accused him of reckless leadership and mismanagement, conveniently ignoring how much they had benefited from his previous success. When the vote came, they unanimously agreed to remove him as CEO. To add insult to injury, the compensation package Daniel was offered was embarrassingly small, barely enough to cover his immediate legal battles, let alone sustain his once lavish lifestyle. Stripped of his title, resources, and support system, Daniel was left to face the fallout alone. His world, once so carefully built, had crumbled within days. If Daniel's troubles had only stopped at losing his company, things might have been easier to handle. But his misfortune didn't end there. It took a painful twist that left him shattered. Vanessa, the woman he had loved deeply and had done everything for during his successful days, broke off their engagement. Her words stung like poison. She accused him of ruining her future, blaming him entirely for their failed plans. Vanessa didn't just leave, she walked away at the moment Daniel needed her support the most. He had sacrificed so much to make her happy, showering her with expensive gifts, funding her dreams, and building a life he thought they'd share. He had molded himself into everything she wanted, or so he believed. But as soon as the storms of life hit, she threw him under the bus, walking away without a second thought. Out of everything he lost, his wealth, his status, his company, this betrayal hurt the most. It wasn't just the loss of a fiancé, it was the realization that his love and sacrifices had meant nothing to her when things got tough. Daniel felt like a failure, not just as a businessman but as a man who had poured his heart into someone who abandoned him at his lowest point. To make things even worse, Daniel became the target of the media's harsh criticism. Headlines called him a disgraced businessman, accusing him of mismanaging his company and wasting investors' money. Every TV station and blog seemed to have something bad to say about him. No one cared to listen to his side of the story. Whenever he tried to explain what happened, his words fell on deaf ears. People had already made up their minds about him, and his reputation was left in ruins. Even the wealthy friends he once spent time with didn't want anything to do with him anymore. They were afraid his bad luck would rub off on them. Slowly but surely they stopped answering his calls and ignored him in public. The people he thought were loyal friends turned out to be nothing more than fair-weather companions. Without money coming in, Daniel couldn't afford the luxurious lifestyle he had built for himself. Soon he was evicted from his expensive penthouse, the one that had once been a symbol of his success. The day he was forced to leave, he stood outside his once luxurious home, watching helplessly as the bank arrived to claim whatever valuables they could. The flashy furniture, the sleek electronics, even the car he once proudly drove, all were taken to repay the loan he had desperately taken out to save his failing company. With nowhere to go, Daniel found himself homeless in the same big city where he had once ruled as a powerful businessman. Now, the streets he had once driven through in flashy cars became the place he slept, his life a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. Daniel wandered the streets every day, determined not to give up. He dressed in the last few decent clothes he had and applied for office jobs wherever he could. During interviews, the employers would often recognize him. His name still carried weight from his days of success. They would smile politely, nod in understanding, and promise to give him a call. But the call never came. It was as if his past achievements now worked against him, a reminder to employers that he had fallen from grace. Daniel was left with little but the clothes on his back. He sold his expensive phones, ones that had once been a symbol of his success, just to scrape together enough money to rent a small rundown room in a low-cost neighborhood. The walls were cracked, the plumbing barely worked, and the space was a far cry from the comfort he had once known. But Daniel kept his head high. Despite losing everything in just a year, his wealth, his home, and the life he had worked so hard to build, Daniel refused to let despair take over. He believed, deep in his heart, that he could rise again. He clung to that hope, even when the world around him seemed to crumble. After another month of trying and failing to get a breakthrough, Daniel's world felt like it was crumbling. The job offers he had once taken for granted were nowhere to be found. His friends, who used to call him for parties and celebrations, were now too busy to even return his messages. His bank account had nearly run dry, and the luxury he had surrounded himself with was slowly slipping away. Sitting alone in his small rented apartment, Daniel's mind wandered to the one person who had never failed him before, his mother. A sharp pang of guilt hit him like a wave. He realized it had been years since he last spoke to her. He couldn't even remember the sound of her voice clearly anymore. His chest tightened as he scrolled through his phone, hoping to find her number. But it wasn't there. Somewhere during his frequent phone upgrades he had lost her contact. She had stopped calling him a long time ago, and now he understood why. She must have given up after all the times he ignored her calls and messages. Meanwhile, back in the village, Mama Daniel had stopped calling her son over a year ago. The decision wasn't easy, it tore at her heart, but it was made after countless sleepless nights filled with tears and prayers. Mama Ngozi, her closest friend and neighbor, finally convinced her to let go. "You've done your part, Mama Daniel," Mama Ngozi had said firmly. "If he has chosen to forget his roots, you must learn to live for yourself now." At first, the pain of not reaching out to her only son felt unbearable. But Mama Ngozi and her family filled the void. They treated Mama Daniel like one of their own. Whenever Mama Ngozi's children brought gifts for their mother, bags of rice, medications, or new wrappers, they made sure to include something for Mama Daniel. This small act of kindness brought her a comfort she hadn't felt in years. With their help, Mama Daniel was finally able to manage her diabetes. The stable supply of medicine and nutritious food meant her health improved significantly. She looked better now than she had in a long time, her cheeks filling out and her smile returning. In a long while, she felt less like a burden and more like a part of a family again. For the first time in years, Daniel felt ashamed. Tears welled up in his eyes as he thought of how his mother had sacrificed everything for him. Her comfort, her health, and even her dignity, just so he could become successful. And what had he done in return? He had abandoned her, left her to struggle in the village while he enjoyed the wealth her sacrifices had made possible. Desperate for her forgiveness, Daniel made the difficult decision to return to the village. He had no choice. His polished suit was replaced by a faded shirt and trousers. His once shiny shoes were scuffed and dusty. He looked nothing like the man who had left the village years ago with promises to change their lives for the better. When he arrived, the dusty roads and simple clay houses greeted him with memories of a life he had long left behind. The villagers stared as he walked past, their curious eyes silently asking the questions he didn't want to answer. Daniel's heart pounded as he approached his mother's small, weathered house. The roof was patched with rusted sheets and the walls showed the wear of time. He paused at the door, his hands trembling. Could he face her after everything? Could she ever forgive him? Swallowing his pride, Daniel knocked softly. The sound echoed in the quietness of the evening. He stood there, disheveled, humiliated, and desperate, hoping that the woman who had given him everything would still have room in her heart to forgive him. Mama Daniel froze when she saw him. The man standing before her was a shadow of his former self, clothes wrinkled and stained, shoes worn thin, and his once proud posture now slouched in defeat. For a moment she almost didn't recognize him. Her heart ached, not from pity, but from the storm of memories that flooded her mind. She remembered the nights she went to bed hungry so he could eat. The long days in the blistering sun, carrying heavy baskets of vegetables to the market, just to afford his school fees. She endured humiliation when she had to beg the village chief for a loan, knowing she might never repay it fully. She gave everything she had, her time, her health, her dignity, just so Daniel could have a future. And yet, the man before her had abandoned her when she needed him most. Her chest tightened as she thought of the years of silence. He had stopped calling, stopped visiting. When she tried to reach him, his responses were cold and distant, as if she were a stranger begging for crumbs. Mama Daniel had been left alone in her small, crumbling hut, battling sickness and old age, while her only son basked in the comfort of his success in the city. Now here he was returned, not out of love or gratitude but because life had humbled him. Her eyes bore into his, searching for the boy she once knew, the boy who used to run to her with scraped knees, seeking comfort. But that boy was gone. All she saw now was a man shaped by greed and pride, a man who had forgotten where he came from. She clenched her fists, her voice steady but laced with pain as she spoke. "The man you became," she said, her words like arrows piercing the silence, "is not the son I raised." Daniel flinched, but she didn't soften her tone. She couldn't. It wasn't anger that fueled her words but heartbreak. How could she embrace him now after all he had done, or rather failed to do? Mama Daniel turned away, her back stiff with the weight of years of disappointment. At that moment, Daniel's shame was palpable. He had come home hoping for forgiveness, for a chance to start over, but he hadn't realized the depth of the wounds he had inflicted on the one person who had loved him unconditionally. Mama Daniel didn't need to say more. Her silence was louder than any words could ever be. The sight of his mother, looking frail yet dignified, struck him harder than he had expected. Every morning since his return, Daniel knelt before his mother, begging for forgiveness. He would clasp her hands tightly, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "Mama, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." At first, Mama Daniel kept silent. She wasn't sure if she could trust his tears after years of neglect. But on the third morning, as she watched her son kneeling with genuine remorse in his eyes, something softened in her heart. "I forgive you," she finally said, her voice shaky but firm. It was the first time in over a year she had allowed herself to feel this much hope. For the first time since his return, Mama Daniel asked him what had gone wrong. She had no idea what had reduced her once proud son to tears. As Daniel began to explain, her heart broke all over again. He told her about the series of failures and betrayals that had led to his downfall, how his once thriving business had collapsed, how the friends he trusted had abandoned him, and how his guilt over neglecting her had haunted him every day. Mama Daniel knew she had to help her son, no matter how much pain he had caused her. Together, they visited elders and spiritual leaders, seeking guidance and solutions for Daniel's woes. At one of these visits, an elder told them something that made both mother and son pause. "You cursed your son, Mama," the elder said gently. "Not with words but with the pain you carried in your heart. That pain became a weight on him. But it's not for you to reverse. Only Daniel can break it, by repenting and changing his ways." The word struck Daniel deeply. He turned to his mother, tears glistening in his eyes, and promised, "I will change, Mama. I will honor those who sacrificed for me. I will never forget where I came from again." As they walked back home, there was a quiet understanding between them. Mama Daniel saw a determination in her son's eyes that hadn't been there before. For the first time in years, she believed he would change. Daniel left that day with a renewed sense of purpose. He was determined to rebuild his life, not just for himself but for his mother and for all those he had failed. And this time he vowed he would make things right. It was a new beginning born from pain, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. Thank you for watching this story of redemption and sacrifice. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay inspired and take care.